The final 10 minutes aboard the New Dawn revealed the true nature of humanity to Zixathala in ways he would never be able to forget. As engineer Pete Walsh worked alone in the reactor chamber to create an explosion that would destroy everything. Within several kilometers, the rest of the crew prepared for their deaths with a calmness that defied all reason. Captain Morrison stood on his bridge giving orders as if he had hours instead of minutes. His voice remained steady and professional while he coordinated the final defense of his ship. All remaining personnel fall back to central positions, seal all bulkheads, and prepare for final decompression sequences. Lieutenant Commander Hayes moved through the bridge checking on her officers and making sure everyone understood their final assignments. She spoke to each person individually, and Zixathala watched their faces as she explained what they needed to do. Not one of them showed fear or hesitation. They nodded grimly and returned to their posts as if death was simply another duty to be performed. The sector boarding parties had penetrated deep into the ship and were fighting their way toward the bridge and the civilian areas. Sergeant Carter and his remaining security teams were falling back through prepared defensive positions, but they were vastly outnumbered and running out of ammunition. Carter's voice came through the communication system with a calmness that chilled Zixathala to his crystalline bones. "Captain, we're down to our last defensive line. They'll breach the civilian sections in about 6 minutes. Request permission to implement final protocol." Morrison didn't hesitate. "Permission granted, Sergeant. Thank you for everything. Final protocol." Zixathala didn't understand what this meant until he watched the security cameras. Carter and his teams had rigged the entire civilian section with explosive charges. When the sector raiders finally broke through the last defensive barriers, they would find nothing but empty rooms filled with bombs. The families and wounded people who had been sheltering in those areas were being moved to a small section near the ship's core where they would die quickly when the reactor exploded. It was considered a mercy compared to what the sector would do to them if they were captured alive. Dr. Amy Foster was among the medical personnel helping to move the wounded to their final location. She had been working for hours without rest to save lives, but now she was helping people prepare to die. Zixathala watched her speak quietly to injured children and comfort frightened parents with the same professional dedication she had shown when treating their wounds. "Doctor, how can you be so calm about this?" he asked her through the communication system. Foster looked up at one of the security cameras and spoke directly to him. "Commander, these people trusted us to protect them and bring them safely to their new home. We failed in that mission, but we won't fail in our final duty to them. They won't suffer and they won't become slaves." This attitude was incomprehensible to Zixathala. The humans had lost their battle, and their ship was doomed, but they acted as if they were achieving some kind of victory. They measured success, not by survival, but by the amount of damage they could inflict on their enemies, and the protection they could provide for their people, even in death. The sector commanders seemed to sense that something was wrong. Their boarding parties had been taking heavy casualties, and now they were reporting strange behavior from the human defenders. Several raider teams had found sections of the ship completely empty, except for explosive traps. Others had discovered corridors filled with poison gas and rooms where the life support had been deliberately shut down. The lead sector ship sent a message to the New Dawn. "Human vessel, you have fought bravely, but your position is hopeless. Surrender now and we will spare the lives of your civilians. Continue to resist, and we will show no mercy." Captain Morrison laughed when he heard this message. It was not a sound of humor, but something darker and more disturbing. "Tell those murdering thieves that humans don't negotiate with slavers. If they want this ship, they can try to take it, but they won't enjoy what they find." 3 minutes remained before the reactor explosion. Zixathala realized that he needed to evacuate to his own ship immediately, or he would die with the humans. He prepared to use his emergency transportation device, but Morrison stopped him. "Commander, you should witness what happens next. Your people need to understand what humanity is capable of when we're pushed too far." The final minutes were a study in organized madness. Pete Walsh reported his progress from the reactor chamber where radiation levels had risen beyond anything that should be survivable. Reactor containment is at 15% and falling. Explosion will occur in approximately 90 seconds. It's been an honor serving with all of you. Morrison opened a ship-wide communication channel. "This is the captain speaking. In 90 seconds our ship will be destroyed, but we will take our enemies with us. Every person aboard this vessel has served with honor and courage. Your sacrifice will be remembered and the galaxy will know that humans do not yield to evil." The response from throughout the ship was immediate and unanimous. Voices from every section called out acknowledgments and farewells. People who were about to die spoke words of encouragement to their shipmates and expressed pride in their service. No one complained about their fate or begged for rescue. Sergeant Carter's final report came through with explosions echoing in the background. "Raiders have breached the inner sections. Final protocol is now active. All charges are armed and ready. See you all on the other side." Dr. Foster's voice was the last one heard from the civilian areas. "All patients are secure and comfortable. Medical teams are standing by for final duties. We're ready, Captain." Zixthala felt his emergency transportation system activate and found himself back aboard his own ship just as the new dawn exploded. The blast was unlike anything he had ever seen. It wasn't just a reactor overload, but a carefully engineered detonation designed to maximize destruction of everything within its range. The explosion tore through 3 sector ships that had moved too close to the human vessel. 2 more raider ships were crippled by debris and radiation from the blast. The sector fleet, which had begun the battle with 12 ships, now had only 7 vessels still capable of fighting. But the true horror was not the physical destruction. It was the realization that the humans had planned this outcome from the beginning. They had never intended to survive the battle. Their entire strategy had been based on the assumption that they would die, and their only goal was to make their deaths as costly as possible for their enemies. The surviving sector ships began to retreat immediately. They had expected to capture a helpless civilian vessel, and instead, they had encountered an enemy that preferred mutual destruction over surrender. This was not the kind of opponent that raiders were equipped to handle. Zixthala's tactical officer reported that the sector fleet was withdrawing from the area at maximum speed. The battle was over, and technically, the Kethmari forces had won. But victory felt meaningless when achieved through such terrible sacrifice. The debris field where the new dawn had been contained, the scattered remains of nearly 3,000 human beings, men and women and children who had chosen to die rather than submit to their enemies. They had turned their passenger ship into a weapon and themselves into ammunition for that weapon. Zixthala ordered his ships to search for survivors, but he knew they would find very few. The humans had been thorough in their self-destruction. Only a handful of escape pods had been launched, and those contained people who had been assigned specific survival missions by their commanders. As his fleet began rescue operations, Zixthala tried to understand what he had witnessed. He had seen many battles in his long career, and he thought he understood the nature of warfare. But this had been something entirely different. The humans had not fought to win or even to survive. They had fought to ensure that their deaths would serve a purpose that was more important to them than life itself. This was not courage or bravery as other species understood those concepts. This was something far more disturbing and alien. It was the complete willingness to embrace death as a tactical option and to use that willingness as a weapon against anyone who threatened their people. The sector attack began without warning. 12 raider ships opened fire on the new dawn from 3 different directions, while Zixthala was still aboard the human vessel. The first salvo of energy weapons tore through the already damaged hull and caused explosions throughout the ship. Emergency alarms rang out and the lights went dark before emergency power kicked in. Zixthala was thrown against a bulkhead by the impact, but the humans on the bridge barely seemed to notice the attack. Captain Morrison calmly gave orders while Lieutenant Commander Hayes coordinated damage control efforts. Their behavior was so different from what he expected that he wondered if they truly understood how desperate their situation had become. "All stations report damage," Hayes called out over the communication system. The reports that came back were terrible. Life support had failed in 6 more sections, and fires were spreading through the lower decks. At least 30 people had been killed in the first attack, and many more were trapped in areas that were rapidly becoming uninhabitable. Any rational species would immediately begin evacuation procedures. Instead, Morrison turned to his weapons officer. "Return fire with everything we have left." The New Dawn's remaining weapons were pathetic compared to what the Sectar ships carried, a few laser cannons and some missile tubes that had somehow survived the original attack. But the humans used them as if they were the most powerful weapons in the galaxy. Each shot was carefully aimed and timed to cause maximum damage to the raider ships. Zix-Thala watched the tactical display as the human weapons managed to damage 2 of the attacking vessels. The Sectar had not expected any resistance from a ship that appeared to be completely helpless. Their formation wavered slightly as they adjusted to this unexpected development. Morrison opened a communication channel to Zix-Thala's ship. "Commander, now would be a good time for your people to join the fight." This was the moment when Zix-Thala should have ordered his fleet to withdraw. The tactical situation was hopeless and engaging. The Sectar would only result in unnecessary casualties among his own crew. But something about the way Morrison spoke made it impossible to abandon the humans to their fate. "All ships open fire on the raider vessels," he commanded. The Kethamari warships had been waiting for this order. Their advanced weapon systems locked onto the Sectar ships and began firing concentrated bursts of energy that lit up the darkness of space. The raiders had not expected to face Confederation military vessels, and several of their ships took heavy damage before they could adjust their tactics. But the Sectar were experienced fighters, and they quickly adapted to the new situation. They split their forces to attack both the Kethamari fleet and the damaged human ship simultaneously. This forced Zix-Thala to make a terrible choice between protecting his own vessels and defending the helpless civilians aboard the New Dawn. The humans made that choice for him. "Commander, take your ships and engage the main raider force," Morrison ordered. "We'll handle the boarding parties." Boarding parties. Zix-Thala realized that several small Sectar vessels had broken away from the main attack and were approaching the New Dawn. The raiders planned to take the ship by force and capture the humans alive for the slave markets. What followed was unlike any battle Zix-Thala had ever witnessed. The humans didn't just fight the boarding parties, they turned their own ship into a weapon against them. Sergeant Carter had positioned his security teams at key points throughout the vessel, and when the Sectar fighters breached the hull, they walked into carefully prepared traps. The first boarding party entered through a hole in the cargo bay. Carter let them advance deep into the ship before triggering explosive charges that sealed them inside a section with no escape route. Then his teams hunted down the trapped raiders one by one using tactics that were brutal and efficient. But the Sectar kept coming. More boarding parties breached the hull in different locations, and each time the humans fell back to prepared positions deeper in the ship. Zix-Thala watched through security cameras as human civilians fought alongside trained soldiers using improvised weapons and desperate courage. Dr. Foster continued treating wounded people even as the battle raged around her medical bay. When Sectar fighters broke through the barricades, she defended her patients with a surgical laser that she had modified into a weapon. Zix-Thala watched her stand over wounded children and refused to retreat even when facing superior numbers. In Dorita, the engineering section, Pete Walsh had sealed himself inside the reactor chamber and was working frantically on something that his instruments couldn't identify. The engineer had taken massive radiation exposure, but he continued working with steady hands while the battle for the ship grew more desperate. The most disturbing thing was how the humans coordinated their defense. They didn't fight to win, because winning was impossible against such overwhelming odds. Instead, they fought to inflict maximum casualties on their enemies regardless of the cost to themselves. When a team of raiders captured a section containing civilian families, the human response was immediate and terrible. Captain Morrison ordered. The emergency bulkhead sealed, trapping both the civilians and their captors inside. Then he had that entire section flooded with poison gas. "Captain, you just killed your own people," Zix-Thala said in shock. Morrison's face was grim, but his voice remained steady. "Those families knew what might happen when they volunteered to be decoys. Better they die quickly than be tortured by raiders." This was madness. The humans were systematically destroying their own ship and killing their own people to deny resources to the enemy. It was a tactic that made no sense from any rational military perspective, but it was devastating in its effectiveness. The Sectar boarding parties found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to surrender and seemed to prefer death over capture. Every corridor became a killing ground, and every room contained traps designed to kill both attackers and defenders. The raiders had expected to face frightened civilians begging for mercy. Instead, they found themselves in a nightmare where their victims fought back with impossible determination. Zixthala tried to help coordinate the defense from his position on the bridge, but the humans barely seemed to need his tactical advice. They were fighting according to principles he didn't understand, using methods that violated everything he knew about proper military conduct. Lieutenant Commander Hayes was directing teams throughout the ship with calm efficiency. She sent people into situations that would certainly result in their deaths, and they went without question or complaint. Her orders were clear and precise, and always focused on inflicting maximum damage on the raiders rather than preserving human lives. Team 4, fall back to Section 12 and prepare for decompression, she ordered. Team 7, you are cleared to detonate your position when overrun. Medical Team 6, evacuate the wounded to Section 20 and prepare for siege conditions. Each order was essentially a death sentence, and everyone involved understood this perfectly. But the humans followed these orders without hesitation because they served a larger purpose that mattered more to them than their individual survival. The battle for the new dawn lasted 4 hours, and by the end, Zixthala was no longer sure which side was winning. The Sectar had taken heavy casualties and several of their ships had been forced to retreat, but the human vessel was being torn apart from the inside, and most of the people aboard were either dead or dying. Pete Walsh's voice came over the communication system one last time. Captain, I've got maybe 10 minutes before the reactor goes critical. You need to get everyone to the escape pods right now. 10 minutes. In 10 minutes, the new dawn would be completely destroyed along with everyone still aboard. This was the moment when any sane species would evacuate and try to preserve whatever lives they could. Instead, Captain Morrison made a decision that showed Zixthala the true horror of the human species. Negative on the evacuation, Pete. We have wounded who can't be moved, and those escape pods won't get far with the Sectar still hunting us. How big an explosion can you give us? Big enough to take 3 or 4 of their ships with us, Captain. Then that's what we'll do. Commander Zixthala stood on the bridge of his ship and watched the stars through the clear metal windows. His 6 arms moved across the control panels with easy grace while his large black eyes studied the data streams flowing past him. The Dai Kethmari had been traveling between stars for over 2,000 years, and Zixthala had spent 300 of those years serving in their military forces. He thought he had seen everything the galaxy could show him. The distress signal came through the communication array just after the morning shift began. The message was weak and full of static, but the universal translator worked well enough to understand the basic meaning. A ship was in trouble and needed help right away. Zixthala ordered his fleet to change course toward the signal source. His tactical officer Vexandra turned her crystalline head toward him and spoke in their musical language. Commander, the signal comes from a human vessel. The ship designation reads as New Dawn. They report engine failure and request immediate assistance. Zixthala nodded slowly. Humans were the newest members of the Galactic Confederation, and most species still knew very little about them. They had only been traveling in space for about 200 years, which made them practically infants compared to the other races. Their technology was basic and their weapons were simple, but they seemed eager to learn and willing to follow Confederation laws. How far to their position? He asked. 6 hours at current speed, Commander. Increase speed to maximum safe velocity. Send a message that help is coming. The Kethmari fleet consisted of 8 warships of different sizes. Each ship carried enough firepower to destroy a small moon, but they were designed for protection rather than conquest. The Confederation believed in peace through strength, and their fleet spent most of their time helping ships in distress or stopping pirates from attacking trade routes. As they traveled toward the human ship, Zixthala studied the files about humanity that were stored in their computer systems. Humans came from a planet called Earth in a quiet part of the galaxy. They had developed faster than light travel on their own, which was unusual but not unknown. Most species received this technology from older races, but humans had figured it out by themselves. Their government was strange compared to other species. Instead of one unified world, they had many different nations that worked together through something they called the United Earth Alliance. This seemed inefficient to Zixthala, but it appeared to work for them. They had built several colony ships and were slowly spreading to nearby star systems. The most interesting thing about humans was their biology. They were much smaller than most intelligent species and seemed quite fragile. They had only 2 arms and 2 legs, and their skin had no natural armor or protection. Their lifespans were short by galactic standards, and they reproduced quickly. Many other species wondered how such weak creatures had managed to develop space travel without destroying themselves first. When the Kethmari fleet arrived at the coordinates, they found the human ship floating dead in space. The New Dawn was much smaller than any of Zixathala's vessels and appeared to be designed for long-distance travel rather than fighting. Massive holes had been burned through its hull, and several sections were completely destroyed. Emergency. Lights blinked along its length, and Zixthala could see that life support was failing in many areas. 3 other ships hung in space near the damaged vessel. These ships were sleek and black with weapons visible along their hulls. Zixthala recognized them immediately as Sectar raider vessels. The Sectar were a nomadic species that survived by attacking other ships and stealing their cargo. They were known throughout the galaxy as brutal killers who took prisoners only to sell them as slaves. The lead Sectar ship sent a communication message to the Kethmari fleet. The voice that came through the speakers was harsh and filled with menace. Confederation ships, you will leave this area immediately. This human vessel belongs to us now. We claim salvage rights. Zixathala felt anger rise in his chest. The Sectar had no legal right to claim salvage on a ship with living people aboard. They were simply using legal language to cover their piracy. He opened a channel to respond, but before he could speak, another voice came through the communications system. This is Captain Jake Morrison of the human vessel New Dawn. We are still alive, and we refuse to surrender to these raiders. Any assistance the Confederation can provide would be greatly appreciated. The human captain's voice was calm and steady despite his desperate situation. Zixthala was impressed by this display of courage under pressure. He had seen many species panic when faced with Sectar raiders, but this human sounded as if he was simply requesting help with a minor technical problem. Zixthala opened a channel to the New Dawn and spoke directly to the human captain. Captain Morrison, this is Commander Zixthala of the Confederation 3rd Fleet. We are here to provide assistance. What is your current status? Commander, we were attacked 3 days ago while traveling to our new colony. The raiders killed 47 of our people and destroyed our main engines. We have been drifting since then, and our life support systems are failing. We have nearly 3,000 people aboard this ship, including many families with young children. The number shocked Zixathala. 3,000 people was a huge population for such a small vessel. Human colony ships were apparently designed to carry many more passengers than Kethmari vessels of similar size. If the life support failed, all of those people would die in the cold vacuum of space. The Sectar commander sent another message to the Kethmari fleet. Confederation fools, these humans attacked us first. We were only defending ourselves. Leave now, or we will consider you to be interfering with our legal salvage operation. This was obviously a lie, but proving it would be difficult. The Sectar were clever about covering their tracks, and they knew how to use Confederation laws to protect themselves. Zixathala could file a formal complaint, but the legal process would take weeks, and the humans would be dead long before then. Captain Morrison's voice came through the communications again. Commander, I know you probably want to follow proper procedures, but my people are dying. Our medical facilities are overwhelmed, and we have children who need help right away. If you can't fight these raiders, I understand, but please at least take our civilians to safety. Zixthala looked at his tactical displays and calculated the odds of success if they engaged the Sectar ships. The enemy had 12 vessels against his 8, and Sectar ships were built specifically for combat. A direct confrontation would be dangerous and might result in heavy casualties among his own crews. Standard Confederation procedure in this situation was clear. He should request reinforcements and maintain a safe distance until help arrived. The proper course of action was to negotiate for the release of civilians while avoiding any action that might escalate the conflict. But 3,000 humans were dying while he followed proper procedures. Captain Morrison seemed to read his thoughts. "Commander, we know the situation looks bad. Our ship can't fight and we can't run. But if you're willing to stand with us, we won't go down without making these killers pay for what they've done. Sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks." Something in the human captain's voice made Zixthala pause. It wasn't desperation or fear. It was something he had never heard before in his 3 centuries of military service. It sounded like absolute certainty that this was a fight worth dying for. Zixthala decided to beam aboard the human ship to assess the situation personally. He took 2 of his officers with him, and they used the Kethmari transportation system to move directly to the New Dawn's bridge. The smell hit him immediately when he materialized in the human ship. It was the smell of burned metal and spilled blood mixed with something else he couldn't identify. The human bridge was much smaller than what he was used to, and everything looked primitive compared to Kethmari technology. Banks of flashing lights covered the walls, and several humans sat at control stations working frantically to keep their ship running. Captain Morrison stood in the center of the room and turned to greet the alien visitors. Morrison was a tall man with gray hair and lines around his eyes that suggested he had lived through many difficult experiences. His uniform was torn and stained, but he stood straight and looked directly at Zixthala when he spoke. "Commander, thank you for coming aboard. I wish we could meet under better circumstances." Zixthala studied the human captain with interest. Most species showed some sign of fear or submission when meeting a Kethmari for the first time. The crystalline aliens were much larger than humans, and their appearance was quite intimidating. But Morrison acted as if he was greeting an old friend, rather than a potentially dangerous alien being. "Captain Morrison, I need to understand your tactical situation before I can decide how to help you. Show me what resources you have available." Morrison nodded and led them to a large display screen that showed a map of the ship. Red sections indicated areas where life support had failed, and yellow sections showed places where people were trapped by damaged bulkheads. The amount of destruction was worse than Zixthala had realized from the outside. A human woman approached them, and Morrison introduced her as Lieutenant Commander Lisa Hayes, his second in command. She was shorter than Morrison, with dark hair pulled back tightly and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. When she spoke, her voice was crisp and professional. "Commander, we have approximately 2,800 people still alive on this ship. Most of our weapons systems are down, but we still have some defensive capabilities. Our main problem is life support failure in the lower sections where we're keeping most of the civilian families." Zixthala studied the tactical display and tried to make sense of the human defensive preparations. What he saw confused him greatly. Instead of concentrating their remaining forces in easily defendable positions, the humans had spread their people throughout the ship in small groups. This seemed like a terrible strategy that would make it impossible to coordinate an effective defense. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes, why have you not moved all your people to the most secure areas of the ship?" Hayes looked at Morrison before answering. "Sir, we have wounded people who cannot be moved safely, and families with small children who need medical attention. We can't abandon them to save ourselves." This made no sense to Zixthala at all. Basic military doctrine required protecting as many lives as possible by consolidating forces in the strongest defensive positions. Spreading people throughout a damaged ship would only result in higher casualties when the raiders attacked. Morrison seemed to understand his confusion. "Commander, I know our tactics probably look strange to you. Most species would try to save as many lives as possible by abandoning the wounded and weak. But that's not how humans operate. We don't leave our people behind." A loud bang echoed through the ship and the lights flickered. Hayes spoke into her communication device. "All stations report status." Several voices responded over the intercom system. Zixthala listened as humans throughout the ship gave updates on their situations. What he heard made him realize that something very unusual was happening on this vessel. In the engineering section, a man named Pete Walsh was working alone to repair the ship's power systems. He had been injured in the original attack and should have been in the medical bay, but he refused to leave his post. "I've got maybe 4 hours of emergency power left," he reported. "If those raiders want this ship, they're going to have to take it before then." In the medical section, Dr. Amy Foster was treating wounded people in conditions that would be considered impossible by most species. She had no proper surgical equipment and very few medical supplies, but she continued working to save lives that any rational being would consider beyond help. "I need more people to help move patients to the intersections," she requested. Throughout the ship, humans were making preparations that defied everything Zixthala understood about military tactics. Instead of preparing to surrender or evacuate, they were turning their damaged vessel into a fortress. They were rigging explosives in the corridors and setting up defensive positions in areas that should have been abandoned. The most disturbing thing was their attitude. None of these humans seemed afraid of dying. They spoke about the coming battle as if it was simply another job that needed to be completed. They made plans for scenarios that would certainly result in their deaths, and they discussed these plans in calm, professional voices. Sergeant Ben Carter was a former soldier who had joined the colony mission to escape Earth's wars. Now he was coordinating the defense of the civilian sections, and his preparations were unlike anything Zixthala had seen before. Carter had divided his small security force into teams that would fight independently, even if communication with the bridge was lost. "Commander, if the raiders breach our outer defenses, we'll fall back through a series of choke points," Carter explained while showing Zixthala a map of the ship's interior. "Each team knows to hold their position until they're completely overrun, and then detonate their sector to deny it to the enemy." Zixthala stared at the human sergeant in shock. "You would destroy parts of your own ship with your own people still inside?" Carter nodded without hesitation. "If it means keeping the raiders away from the civilian sections, yes, sir. Better to die fighting than let those animals get their hands on our families." This was madness. No rational species would willingly destroy their own ship and kill their own people just to inflict casualties on an enemy. The logical response to overwhelming force was negotiation or surrender, not mutual destruction. But as Zixthala observed the humans preparing for battle, he began to realize that they were not operating according to any logic he understood. Their decisions were based on principles that seemed to matter more to them than survival itself. Captain Morrison took him to see the civilian sections where families were preparing for the coming attack. Zixthala expected to find panic and despair, but instead he found something much more disturbing. The humans were calm and organized. Parents were explaining to their children what might happen, and the children were listening with serious expressions. A woman named Julie Kim was organizing the medical volunteers. She was a nurse by training, but she was also teaching civilians how to treat wounded people and how to help defend their families if the raiders broke through the security barriers. "Everyone who can hold a weapon will fight," she explained to Zixthala. "Everyone who can help the wounded will stay with them until the end." The end. She spoke about dying as if it was simply the conclusion of a story, rather than something to be feared and avoided. This casual attitude toward death was perhaps the most alien thing Zixthala had encountered in his long career. He returned to the bridge where Morrison and Hayes were coordinating with his own ship's tactical officers. The Sectar raiders were moving into attack positions, and it was clear that the battle would begin soon. Standard procedure would be for the Kethmari ships to withdraw to a safe distance and attempt diplomatic contact with the raiders. Instead, Morrison was discussing combined tactics as if the two fleets were already committed to fighting together. "Commander, your ships have better shields and weapons than ours, but we know this sector better than you do. If we coordinate our attacks, we can make those raiders pay dearly for every meter they advance." Zixthala found himself agreeing to battle plans that violated everything he had been taught about proper military conduct. The humans were drawing him into their madness, and he was not sure he could resist their strange influence. In the aftermath of the battle, Zixthala found himself alone with 37 human survivors, scattered across 3 escape pods. These were the people who had been specifically chosen to live, so they could tell the story of what had happened aboard the New Dawn. Each one had been selected for their skills and their ability to help rebuild human civilization somewhere else. Dr. Amy Foster was among the survivors, and she immediately began treating wounded people using medical supplies that had been carefully packed into the escape pods. Her hands moved with the same steady precision she had shown during the battle, but now Zixthala could see the cost of what she had endured. Her eyes held a depth of pain that he had never seen in any living being. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Hayes sat in the corner of the main rescue pod, writing on a portable computer. When Zixathala asked what she was doing, she looked up with an expression that made his crystalline spine tingle with unease. "I'm writing letters to the families of the people who died today, Commander. 3,000 letters explaining how their loved ones chose to die rather than surrender to raiders. Each family deserves to know that their sacrifice meant something." The calm way she spoke about such a massive tragedy disturbed Zixathala more than the battle itself had. Hayes wrote each letter individually, with personal details about how each person had contributed to their final victory. She remembered names and faces and final words with perfect clarity despite the chaos she had lived through. Sergeant Ben Carter was helping to organize the survivors and plan for their eventual resettlement. He worked with quiet efficiency, making lists of supplies they would need and skills they possessed. When Zixathala spoke to him about the battle, Carter's response revealed something that would haunt the alien commander for the rest of his life. "Commander, we knew from the beginning that most of us wouldn't survive this trip. Human colony missions are dangerous and people die. What happened today was unusual only in scale. We've been dying for our principles and our families for thousands of years. It's what makes us human." This casual acceptance of death as a normal part of human existence was perhaps the most alien thing Zixathala had encountered. Other species certainly died in battles and accidents, but humans seemed to view death as simply another tool to be used when necessary. They planned for it and prepared for it, and when the time came, they embraced it without hesitation. As his ships carried the survivors toward the nearest Confederation base, Zixathala tried to write his official report about the battle. How could he explain what he had witnessed to military commanders who had never encountered anything like human warfare? How could he describe the horror of watching an entire ship's crew choose mutual destruction over surrender? The tactical aspects of the battle were easy to document. The Sectar had attacked with superior numbers and firepower, but had been defeated by a combination of Kethmari technology and human determination. 7 raider ships had been destroyed or disabled while the Confederation forces had suffered only minor damage. But the real significance of what had happened could not be captured in a standard military report. Zixathala had witnessed the emergence of a new kind of warfare, based on principles that defied everything the galaxy understood about rational behavior. The survivors provided more insight into human nature during the long journey to the Confederation base. They spoke about their dead shipmates with a mixture of grief and pride that confused Zixathala. They mourned their losses, but they also celebrated the fact that those deaths had served a purpose. Dr. Foster explained the human concept of acceptable casualties while treating a wounded child. "Commander, your people fight wars to achieve objectives with minimal losses. You calculate risks and benefits and try to find the most efficient path to victory. Humans fight wars to protect principles that matter more to us than survival. We measure victory not by who lives, but by whether we preserved what we were fighting for." This difference in perspective explained much about what Zixathala had observed during the battle. The humans aboard the New Dawn had not been trying to win a tactical engagement. They had been trying to demonstrate that some things were worth dying for, and that anyone who threatened those things would pay a terrible price. The implications of this discovery were staggering. Humanity had been accepted into the Galactic Confederation as a junior partner that would need guidance and protection from older, more advanced species. But what Zixathala had witnessed suggested that humans might be the most dangerous species in the galaxy, precisely because they were willing to die for their beliefs. When they reached the Confederation base, news of the battle had already spread throughout the local sector. Other species were struggling to understand how a primitive human colony ship had managed to destroy 7 Sectar raider vessels. The official reports focused on technical details and tactical innovations, but they missed the real significance of what had happened. Zixathala requested a private meeting with the base commander to discuss his observations about human warfare. Admiral Kextaroth was an experienced military officer who had served in conflicts throughout the galaxy, but even he was disturbed by Zixathala's report. "Commander, are you suggesting that humans are inherently more aggressive than other species? Their psychological profiles indicate that they are actually quite peaceful compared to many races we have encountered." Zixthala struggled to find words that could convey what he had learned. Admiral, humans are not more aggressive than other species, but they are infinitely more dangerous. They have the ability to transform any conflict into a war of mutual annihilation, simply by refusing to accept defeat. Any enemy that fights humans must be prepared to kill every single one of them because they will never surrender. The Admiral studied the tactical reports with growing concern. "What do you recommend, Commander?" "I recommend that we offer humanity a full military alliance immediately, not because they need our protection, but because we need to ensure they remain our friends. A species this willing to die for their principles will find a way to destroy their enemies, regardless of the odds against them." Over the following weeks, Zixthala interviewed each of the survivors individually to better understand human psychology and military doctrine. What he learned convinced him that the Battle of the New Dawn had been a relatively mild example of what humans were capable of when threatened. Sergeant Carter described historical battles where humans had held defensive positions against impossible odds, simply to buy time for their people to escape. Dr. Foster told stories of human medical personnel who had stayed with patients in disaster zones, knowing they would die rather than abandon their duties. Lieutenant Commander Hayes provided the most disturbing information of all. "Commander, what you witnessed aboard our ship was humans fighting to protect strangers. We maintained discipline and followed proper procedures because we were representing our species to the galaxy. You should pray that you never see what we become when we're fighting for revenge." The cold certainty in her voice when she said this made Zixthala's crystalline neurons ring with alarm. He realized that the humans had been restraining themselves during the battle. Their response to the sectar attack had been measured and controlled compared to what they were truly capable of. In his final report to Confederation Command, Zixthala wrote words that would change galactic politics for generations to come. "Humanity represents a fundamental shift in the balance of power within our civilization. They are not the primitive newcomers we believed them to be. They are apex predators who have learned to disguise their nature behind polite diplomacy and peaceful intentions." He paused before adding the final paragraph that would define humanity's role in galactic affairs. "I have stood with humans in battle, and I now understand true horror. It is not the fear of death or the pain of defeat. It is the realization that some species will choose extinction over surrender and call it victory. The galaxy has two choices regarding humanity. We can ensure they remain our allies, or we can prepare for a war that will end only when every human in the universe is dead." The Confederation chose alliance, and humanity began its rise to become one of the most respected military powers in the galaxy. But Zixthala never forgot the lesson he had learned aboard the dying human ship. Humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or their numbers, but their absolute refusal to accept that any fight was hopeless, as long as they could still inflict damage on their enemies. Years later, when other species asked him about human military capabilities, Zixthala would always give the same warning. Humans fight wars that cannot be won and somehow find a way to win them. They measure victory not by survival, but by the cost they impose on anyone who threatens what they value. Pray that you never give them a reason to demonstrate this principle against you.